Chapter 5. Grief. The city woke up wrong. Not louder, not angrier, disoriented. I knew it before the scanner confirmed it, before my phone started vibrating itself off the table. Chicago has a rhythm to its violence, a tempo you learn if you stand close enough to it for long enough. This morning the rhythm stuttered, skipped a beat, then tried to restart in the wrong key. 3 scenes before breakfast. Different neighborhoods, different gangs, too close together to be coincidence. I drove until my hands hurt. The first was behind a closed daycare, the kind of place that still smelled faintly like crayons and disinfectant even after years of neglect. Mulch scattered beneath a jungle gym that hadn't heard laughter in months. The body lay face down, arms tucked beneath him like he'd tried to make himself smaller at the end. One wound, clean, no shell casings, no mess. It felt surgical. The second was under a stairwell by the river, concrete walls funneling sound into a hollow echo. He'd been kneeling when it happened. You could tell by the angle, by the way his body folded forward instead of collapsing outright. His phone lay a few feet away, screen still lit with a half-typed message that would never be sent. The third wasn't dead yet when they found him. Pinned between 2 parked cars, chest rising in wet, broken increments, blood bubbling at his mouth every time he tried to breathe. He stared at the officers with something like awe, like he'd finally understood the rules too late. They took him away fast. He didn't make it. None of this looked like gang war. Gang war is loud, wasteful, proud of itself. This was coordination. CPD hated that word. I heard it in the way detectives talked around it, in the way commanders snapped at lieutenants for using language that implied someone was ahead of them. Press briefings became exercises in deflection. Questions went unanswered. Statements contradicted themselves before the microphones cooled. I watched a superintendent pause too long when someone asked if the killings were linked. "We don't have evidence of that," he said finally. Everyone knew that wasn't true. You don't get 3 precise removals across the city before breakfast by accident. You get that by design. I filed updates faster than I could verify them. One article went live while another was already obsolete. Readers accused me of exaggeration, of fear-mongering, of chasing ghosts. Then the 4th body turned up. That shut them up. Justice. Daniel stopped thinking in individuals. Names are sentimental. Names invite hesitation. He thought in functions. The man behind the daycare was logistics. The one under the stairwell was communications. The third was enforcement, sloppy, overconfident, replaceable. Together they formed a circuit. Circuits can be overloaded. Daniel moved through the city with discipline, timing each action to fracture response. He didn't linger. He didn't watch outcomes. He trusted anatomy and physics to finish what he started. What mattered was spacing. The closeness of the removals would confuse law enforcement, split attention, introduce doubt. Doubt slows reaction. Slowed reaction compounds fear. Fear does the rest. He felt the city react before it understood why. Sirens converging in the wrong places, traffic snarling, phones lighting up with conflicting instructions. This wasn't escalation, it was compression. He wiped his hands on a disposable rag and dropped it into a public trash can already overflowing with receipts, coffee cups, and yesterday's news. It disappeared without ceremony. That felt right. This wasn't about standing out. This was about disappearing into noise. Daniel listened later, radio low to the aftermath unfold. Police confusion, gangs locking down hard, meetings canceled, phones burned. Good. The system was cannibalizing itself now. Grief. The press conference was a disaster. 4 podiums, 6 microphones, no answers. CPD talked about ongoing investigations and community engagement while reporters shouted over one another, trying to force a shape onto something that refused to hold still. Someone asked if they believed there was a single actor. The answer took too long. "We're looking at all possibilities," the superintendent said. That wasn't leadership. That was surrender. I wrote the piece without quotes, without attribution. Just facts laid out like a crime scene diagram the public wasn't supposed to see. 4 men, 4 locations. One morning. I described confusion as a weapon, how fear multiplies when authority can't explain itself, how gangs behave when the rules they depend on stop applying. Readers felt it. They wrote to me in panic. "Is this the same guy? Why can't they stop him? Are we safe?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. Justice. Daniel felt the strain now. Not physical. Mental. Sustaining this level of focus required a narrowing of self that left little room for anything else. He noticed it the way you notice a joint that's been overused. Not pain yet, but warning. Grief pressed harder at the edges. He didn't fight it. He redirected it. Justice, he reminded himself, isn't mercy. Justice is completion. Grief. That night, I stood in my kitchen with maps taped to the wall and realized something that made my stomach drop. The violence wasn't spreading outward. It was folding inward, like someone tightening a knot. CPD didn't know who they were chasing. The gangs didn't know who they were hiding from. But someone out there knew exactly what they were doing. And whoever it was, they weren't done. I leaned my forehead against the wall and closed my eyes, letting the weight of it settle. I wasn't just covering a story anymore. I was tracking a mind, and that realization scared me more than the bodies ever had. Chapter 6. Grief. I almost missed it because it didn't belong. That's how mistakes hide, by looking human in a place that's been stripped of it. The scene was tucked behind a strip mall that had died slowly, the way some parts of the city do. Empty storefronts, faded signs promising services nobody needed anymore, a service corridor that smelled like wet cardboard and old oil. The body lay near the dumpsters. He'd been killed cleanly. One wound. Efficient. Familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. No spectacle this time. No display. Just removal. But something was wrong. His pockets had been turned out carefully, not rifled. Methodical. As if someone had been searching for one specific thing and didn't want the rest. A tech knelt nearby and nudged something with a gloved hand. "Hey," he said, voice low. "You see this?" A photograph slid across the concrete and came to rest near my shoe. A school picture. A kid smiling too hard, gap-toothed, backpack straps too big for his shoulders. The kind of picture parents keep folded in wallets until the edges soften and the ink starts to fade. There was handwriting on the back. Blue pen, looping, and personal. A date. Years ago. This wasn't gang paraphernalia. This wasn't a message. This wasn't strategy. This was memory. My throat went dry. Machines don't leave photographs behind. CPD didn't know what to do with it. I watched the lieutenant order it bagged quickly. Too quickly. His eyes flicked around like the object might accuse him if it stayed out in the open long enough. "Victim got kids?" I asked a detective I'd spoken to a dozen times before. He hesitated. "Yeah," he said. "Why?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Back home, I rebuilt the wall. Maps, timelines, cross streets, all the clean lines that had made this feel inevitable, and then I added something new, something that didn't fit. Artifacts. First, killing. Nothing left behind. Second, public display. Third, scale and speed. And now this. Added until my eyes burned and felt the story tilt. This wasn't ideology. This wasn't abstraction. This was a man oscillating between control and collapse, between justice and something far more dangerous. For the first time since this began, I stopped asking what was happening. I started asking who. Justice. Daniel knew the moment he saw it that he shouldn't touch it. The photograph sat inside the man's wallet, creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. A child, young, smiling, unaware of how fragile that moment had been. Daniel felt the shift immediately, a pressure behind the eyes, a narrowing of focus that had nothing to do with the mission. This was new. He told himself to leave it. He took the photo out and held it longer than necessary, long enough to register the handwriting, the date, the age the child would be now, too close to his son's. That was the mistake, not the killing. The pause afterward. Daniel placed the photograph on the ground instead of returning it to the wallet. He didn't know why. A reflex, an offering, a confession to nobody. He stepped away immediately, pulse elevated for the first time since this started. This wasn't acceptable. Emotion contaminates judgment. That doctrine had been drilled into him long before grief had a name, long before a program had taught his brain how to seal certain doors. He moved fast after that, but the alignment was gone. Something had shifted. Later, alone, Daniel tried to reconstruct the error. Fatigue, overextension, cognitive saturation. Those were safe explanations. The truth was less manageable. The thing that had been done to him, whatever cocktail of conditioning and chemistry had flattened his ability to grieve, wasn't holding the way it used to. Memory was pushing through in fragments. Not pain yet. Pressure. Leakage. Daniel sat at the table and stared at the wall until his eyes ached. If grief started shaping decisions, the mission would collapse, and collapse meant chaos. He adjusted immediately. Shorter timelines, reduced exposure, no artifacts, no pauses. The system would hold. It had to. Grief. I didn't publish the photograph. Not because I was ethical, because I didn't know how to frame it without lying. Instead, I wrote about inconsistency, about how the latest killing deviated subtly from the established logic, about how even the most disciplined violence leaves fingerprints if it goes on long enough. The response came fast. Emails from cops asking what I knew, messages from readers who felt the shift but couldn't name it. One anonymous DM that just said, "He's angry now. Not they, not it. I poured a drink and didn't taste it. I pinned a description of the photograph to the wall and stepped back. Somewhere in this city, a man had crossed from strategy into memory, and I was close enough now to feel the heat coming off him. Justice. Daniel recalibrated. No more sentiment, no more symbols, no more room for error. The city was almost restructured, almost quiet in the right places. He just needed to finish before anyone learned how to read him. But when he closed his eyes, the image surfaced uninvited. Not his son, the other child, the one in the photograph, smiling. Daniel opened his eyes and exhaled slowly. Recognition was now the real threat, not capture, not consequence. Being understood. Chapter 7. Grief. The police stopped pretending. You can feel the moment when an institution shifts from confidence to containment. It's subtle. Less bravado, more doors closed, voices drop, meetings happen without minutes. People who used to return your calls suddenly ask how you got their number. CPD formed a task force and acted like that meant something. Unmarked cars clustered outside precincts. Detectives who'd never shared before started guarding information like currency. Command staff rotated faces through press briefings, none of them willing to stand long enough to own the answers. I hovered at the edges, notebook in hand, pretending neutrality while grief did slow, irreversible work on my insides. It wasn't the bodies anymore. It was the families. Mothers pacing hospital hallways with phones clenched like lifelines. Fathers staring at the floor during press conferences, eyes unfocused, as if gravity had suddenly increased. Kids walking to school in tighter groups, heads down, learning caution before they learned algebra. I interviewed a woman outside a laundromat who told me she prayed 2 different prayers every night. "One that my boy gets out," she said, "and one that whoever's doing this skips him." She laughed when she realized what she'd said. It wasn't humor, it was surrender. The street talk had shifted. People didn't ask why anymore. They asked how long. Some blocks felt safer. Others felt radioactive. Gangs pulled back in places they'd owned for years, leaving behind silence that felt unnatural, like a theater after the audience leaves mid-performance. I wrote about fear from both directions. Parents terrified their kids would be next, and neighbors relieved they could sit on their stoops again without scanning for trouble. The comments split clean down the middle. Justice. Murder. Finally. Monster. I read them all, hating myself a little more each time. Grief has a way of sharpening curiosity into obsession. I started retracing scenes at odd hours, listening for echoes that hadn't been recorded. I noticed how the violence clustered not just by location, but by function. The same kinds of men disappearing across different gangs. That realization settled heavy in my chest. This wasn't personal vendetta. This was strategy, and strategy implies patience, which meant whoever was doing this wasn't finished. Justice. Daniel knew he was being felt now. Not seen, not identified, but felt. The city had shifted. Law enforcement had compressed its posture. Gangs were collapsing inward faster than he'd predicted, leadership retreating into spaces that felt familiar enough to confuse safety with nostalgia. Fear was doing its work, but fear also attracts attention. The photograph had been a warning, proof that containment wasn't perfect, that memory could surface at the wrong moment and leave residue behind. Daniel couldn't afford another slip, so he changed the equation. No more attrition, no more incremental dismantling. This would be decisive. He identified the meeting 3 days before it happened, not through surveillance theatrics or lucky breaks, but because organizations under pressure behave predictably. They seek consolidation. They mistake proximity for protection. The location was residential, a narrow house on a quiet block, basement access through a side door that had been repainted too many times. Cars arriving spaced just far enough apart to feel cautious. Leadership. Not the loud ones, the ones who gave permission. Daniel waited, not for courage, for alignment. When he moved, it was without hesitation. The basement smelled like mildew and sweat and old cologne. A single bulb swung overhead, casting shadows that turned faces into masks. Conversation died mid-sentence when he appeared. There was no announcement, no warning. Gunfire in an enclosed space doesn't echo. It crushes. Pressure slammed into bone and concrete alike, sound turning physical, violent. Muzzle flashes strobing off cinderblock walls. Men falling where they stood, bodies colliding, chairs tipping, a folding table flipping under weight that didn't matter anymore. It was over in seconds. Silence rushed in afterward, thick and ringing. Daniel stood among them, chest rising, ears screaming, the smell of burned powder and blood coating the air like fog. Leadership lay broken across the concrete. A structure dismantled in one room. This wasn't disruption. This was decapitation. Grief. They called it in as multiple victims. They always start there, like the words might soften what follows. I arrived as medics backed out of the house, faces blank, movements automatic. The block looked wrong, too quiet, too domestic. Porch lights still on, A child's bike tipped over on the lawn next door. Bodies came out in sequence, not rushed, not chaotic, deliberate. I counted without meaning to. 3, 4, 5. Inside, the basement looked like the inside of a machine that had failed catastrophically. Blood sprayed high enough to stain the ceiling. Bullet impacts clustered tight on the walls, too tight for panic. This wasn't a firefight. This was intent. I stood at the curb and felt grief finally crest, not for the men inside, but for the clarity settling into my bones. Someone had decided the system had failed and replaced it. Justice. Daniel left through the back, stepping into cold air that felt unreal after the basement. Sirens were already converging. Good. Visibility mattered this time. He didn't feel relief. He felt emptiness, the kind that follows completion when the thing you've built your life around suddenly stops holding you upright. This was the end of the campaign, or close enough. As he walked away, blending into the night, awareness pressed forward, unwelcome and sharp. Someone would connect this. Someone patient. Someone grieving. Someone already too close. Daniel didn't turn around, but for the first time since his son hadn't come home, he wondered whether justice could survive being seen. Chapter 8. Grief. I stopped chasing scenes and started chasing people. The tape came down faster now. The blood dried quicker. CPD learned how to move bodies out of sight before the cameras arrived. But the fear didn't leave with the ambulances. It stayed behind, coiled in voices, in the way parents gripped their kids' wrists crossing streets they'd walked their whole lives. I talked to a mother on 63rd who wouldn't give me her name. Her eyes never stopped moving. "My oldest's in it," she said, cigarette trembling between her fingers. "I tried. God knows I tried. But when you're born on a block like this, you don't choose so much as you inherit." She exhaled smoke and something close to a sob. "Now I don't know if I'm supposed to pray he gets out," she said, "or pray he survives." 2 blocks over, an old man leaned on his broom outside a barber shop that had stayed open later than usual. The windows were clean. The chairs inside were full. "It's quieter," he said, like he was afraid the word might hear him. "Hasn't been this quiet in years." "Do you feel safer?" I asked. He thought about it. "I feel less hunted," he said. "Don't know if that's the same thing." That sentence stayed with me. Safety implies trust. This felt like reprieve. I wrote it all down. The relief, the fear, the contradiction. I let the city argue with itself on the page, parents begging for it to stop, shop owners thanking whoever was doing it, kids walking to school again without escorts. And underneath it all, the same question, asked without ever being spoken out loud. How long does this last? Justice. Daniel didn't announce the expansion. He didn't need to. The message had already traveled, through whispers, through absences, through meetings that never happened. Other gangs began behaving differently before he touched them. Corners went unmanned. Leadership stopped showing up in person. Money moved slower, if at all. Fear was working, but fear alone is unstable. So he applied pressure selectively. Different neighborhoods, different affiliations, same logic. This wasn't personal. It was structural. He identified functions, not faces. Men who moved money, men who passed orders, men who enforced consequences. He removed just enough to destabilize without inviting chaos. The city responded in fragments. Some blocks relaxed, others braced. Gangs retreated inward, cannibalizing their own structures in the absence of clarity. Mistakes bloomed where confidence used to live. Daniel watched from a distance, noting which organizations adapted and which panicked. Panicked ones didn't last. Grief. The calls came at all hours now. Some people begged me to stop writing, said I was putting targets on backs just by describing the pattern. Others thanked me like I'd personally cleared their block. A teacher emailed from a school on the west side. Attendance is up. Kids are walking to class again. Whatever's happening, don't make it stop. That one hurt. So did the voicemail from a father who'd lost his son 3 nights earlier. He wasn't a bad kid, the man said, voice breaking mid-sentence. He was stupid. That's not the same thing. I sat in my car afterward, hands locked on the steering wheel, feeling the city pull me in opposite directions. Safer streets, dead suns. Both true. Neither clean. I wrote the next piece without a headline, just voices stacked on top of each other until the reader had to choose where to stand. Some called it justice, some called it murder. Most didn't know what to call it at all. Neither did I. Justice. Daniel started noticing the collateral, not bodies, stories. Snippets overheard on buses, arguments in grocery aisles, parents negotiating curfews that no longer made sense, kids asking why certain streets were suddenly empty. This hadn't been part of the model. Models don't account for relief braided with terror. At night, alone, the strain showed itself, not as regret, but as awareness. Holding the line required constant recalibration. The margin between control and collapse felt narrower now. He adjusted again. Fewer actions, more observation, let rumor do the work. Justice isn't about satisfaction, he reminded himself. It's about outcomes. Grief. I walked through a park at dusk where kids played without scanning the street. Laughter echoed between apartment buildings that had swallowed too many screams. It was beautiful. It was obscene. I sat on a bench and watched parents relax muscles they'd kept tense for years, watched the city inhale without choking. And I thought about the father, not as a suspect, not as a villain, as a man somewhere in this city, carrying a grief heavy enough to bend streets around him. I wondered what happens when grief becomes policy. Justice. Daniel stood on an overpass and watched traffic flow beneath him, headlights stitching the city back together. He had dismantled more than one organization now, enough to change behavior, enough to alter patterns. The city was quieter. But quiet isn't peace. It's suspension. He knew that. The question wasn't how much more he could do. It was whether stopping would undo everything he'd forced into place. For the first time since the night his son didn't come home, Daniel didn't know the answer. And not knowing, truly not knowing, felt more dangerous than any gunshot.